I'm Sam Bajvaroff, and I'm obsessed with the science of how to get more out of life. In today's video, we're going to talk about why nutritional guidelines aren't always as based on science as you'd want them to be. Have you ever wondered why so many Americans start their day with cereal? Or why cholesterol has been labeled the villain of modern health for decades? What if I told you that these narratives can actually be traced back to a surprising link between special interest groups misrepresenting science and our current nutritional guidelines, and that it's still shaping what we eat today? This is the third installment in the Evolutionary Perspectives on Human Diet series, where we're exploring the historical, scientific, and ethical truths about why humans are biologically meant to eat meat. If you're here and you haven't watched the first two videos, no problem. You don't need to. Each episode stands on its own, and you can jump right in here without missing a beat. In this episode, we're going to dive into a controversial but fascinating topic related to how the sugar industry, and also, bizarrely, a group called the Seventh-day Adventists, have impacted nutritional science. We're also going to explore the new theories about the surprising intelligence of plants, and how regenerative agriculture could actually redefine the way we think about our food system. Trust me, by the end of this video, you are never going to look at your plate or your breakfast cereal the same way again. So this story has an interesting and surprising beginning. Where do you think the belief that vegetarianism was actually healthy came from? It seems to have come from when the British Empire went into India, and there was a backflow of ideas that linked vegetarianism to spiritual purity. So in the 1700s, we can begin to trace various religious leaders advocating for vegetarianism as a way to become more spiritually pure, which is very interesting. So in this era of the 1700s and the early 1800s, medicine was really not based on science at all. There was all sorts of interesting things. For example, we used to think that diseases were caused by an imbalance of humors, which actually came from the time of Aristotle. So as a result, medicine was pretty far separated from actual science. To make a long story short, from the 1700s, when we see vegetarianism linked to spiritual purity, you begin to see several doctors that are also linked to this sort of idea of spiritual purity begin to advocate for it as a health mechanism. This was without actually any science behind that, but it made sense to them, essentially. In the 1820s, there was a health revolution where there was a lot more writing about how vegetarianism was actually healthy. This was advocated for by doctors who had very limited understanding of the science involved in medicine. For example, if you chopped part of your foot off, they would take the bottom of a shoe and not sterilize it and just stitch it to you. This was an interesting era where people had strong enough immune systems to live through the medical treatments that they were subjected to. Fascinatingly, in the mid-1800s, Ellen White was a prophetess who had a series of visions, many of them actually related to health. This is quite a controversial thing within the Seventh-day Adventist community, because it was later revealed that Ellen White, because she ran a publishing company, actually published many texts that had been written by these 1820 doctors advocating for vegetarianism. Interestingly, visions that she had about health exactly aligned with what these other previous people had said, and she had their books on her bookshelf. So one of the really interesting parts about the beliefs that were advocated for in the 1820s and then that Ellen White advocated for, meat caused harmful, lustful propensities, and that it weakened your moral strength. Very interestingly, these ideas became one of the most foundational aspects of Seventh-day Adventism, and they got exported out in a surprising way. For example, there's an individual named John Harvey Kellogg, and yes, that actually is the same as Kellogg's cereal, but the Kellogg cereal is actually his younger brother who split off. So John Harvey Kellogg had this thing called the sanatorium, which was basically this hospital/resort for the most powerful people in the world. Almost all the presidents from the late 1800s to around 1940 went and were personally treated by John Harvey Kellogg there. And a ton of other prominent people, including many prominent doctors, Ford, who was behind Ford Motors, as well as a great many of the most powerful journalists of the era. In general, the sanatorium advocated for a vegetarian diet. And in fact, many of the things that we think of today as common breakfast staples were invented at the sanatorium, either by John Harvey Kellogg or his brother, Will Kellogg, or perhaps some other people in there. It could have been John Harvey Kellogg's wife as well. The history is a little bit dubious. But things like granola, cereal, and a wide variety of other things were invented actually at the sanatorium. The reason why all these powerful people getting treatment there and getting indoctrinated by this diet is an important thing is, why did it get exported out so rapidly? If you have every president, all the most powerful journalists, a great many of the most famous doctors and scientists all coming here and participating in this thing, that's one of the reasons why this got exported out so dramatically. Another big reason, though, is that part of the Adventist mission is this diet aspect. So the Adventist health hospitals also play a big role in this, and they are actually excellent hospitals, but they do also advocate for a vegetarian diet because of this religious practice. And then there's one other critically important point. The Seventh-day Adventist University Loma Linda Institute is one of the primary drivers of nutritional science in this country, and has been for quite a long time now. They are behind a lot of the research that linked meat or dairy to diseases like cancer. This is a very important point because we can begin to see how belief systems can influence science. The researcher behind the study that linked dairy to prostate cancer was asked if he would be able to come to a conclusion in his science that differed from what his religious beliefs said. And he said that would be very difficult. That's a very alarming thing for somebody that is essentially putting forward the idea in your head that if you drink kefir, for example, or milk, you are more likely to get prostate cancer. Fascinatingly, they did a meta-analysis of the data that he used and found that it actually did not conclude what he put forward as this really headline-splashing finding, that dairy increased your risk of prostate cancer. That alone should show you this is actually quite an alarming situation. That's not the only thing, though. They are behind many of the studies that we use to form our nutritional guidelines. And there's a remarkable study written by Seventh-day Adventists that talks about how the Seventh-day Adventists influenced nutritional science. It should be mandatory reading for anyone who is talking about nutritional science. From their perspective, they're doing a very good thing by influencing it so heavily. Understanding that they can't reach conclusions that are as distinct from their beliefs should kind of throw up a little red flag here. You know, we do want our science to be really just trying to find out what is the best for us, not something that is advocating for a specific belief system. By the mid-20th century, the Adventists were influencing key health panels and guidelines that shaped global dietary recommendations. And while this might sound like progress, the evidence they relied on wasn't always robust or free from bias. They weren't the only group involved in this distortion. Take the demonization of cholesterol and saturated fats, for example. These ideas became central to our modern dietary advice, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. For instance, a landmark 2002 study revealed that C-reactive protein, or CRP, which is a marker of systemic inflammation, is a far better predictor of heart disease and cholesterol levels. Yet for decades, we've been told to avoid animal fats and red meat based on shaky science, and science that's been heavily influenced by industries such as the Sugar Research Foundation, which literally paid Harvard researchers to point the blame at saturated fat instead of sugar. And it came a few years after the sugar industry realized that if they could direct people towards a low-fat diet, they would make a ton more profit. So this is a reminder to question how narratives are built and whose interests they serve. But what happens when we challenge these narratives? When we start to untangle fact from fiction, we discover not only the truth about meat, but also fascinating insights into our planet and the future of our food systems. So let's dive a little deeper here. Let's talk about plants, because their story is just as surprising. For as long as we can remember, plants have been thought of as passive, these unconscious organisms that simply sit there soaking up sunlight and water. Some fledgling science is revealing something far more complex, and it's reshaping our understanding of life itself. Researchers now believe that there's good evidence to consider plants to be dynamic, intelligent organisms that actively communicate, make decisions, even show signs of learning, and actually pass down information intergenerationally. For example, plants use a mycelium network, essentially an underground fungal internet system, to share nutrients and information. If one plant in the network is sick, others can send healing compounds directly to it. Isn't that crazy? Plants have a built-in healthcare system, but that's actually just scratching the surface. Plants don't just respond to their environment, they actually analyze it. Here's a remarkable example. A bean plant being attacked by a spider mite can actually read the predator's saliva and release a pheromone that calls in the spider mite's natural predators. These behaviors actually challenge our definition of intelligence and sentience and force us to rethink our relationship with the natural world. Because if plants are this sophisticated, what does that mean for how we treat them? We'll explore this further in a future episode, but here's another mind-blowing fact. Plants use many of the same neurotransmitters as humans: serotonin, dopamine, and glutamate, to name a few. These chemicals are part of a universal language of life, although they do serve different functions in different situations. For example, the serotonin in your gut does not serve the same purpose as the serotonin in your brain. But the more we learn, the more it seems like plants may be conscious just on a different timescale than animals. Now let's tie it all together. If meat is not the villain that we've been told it is, and plants are far more complex than we ever realized, how do we move forward? I had a good friend who said that he would not be able to continue living if it turned out that plants are conscious. But the reality here is that there is always an exchange of energy to stay alive in this world. So if meat isn't the villain we've been told it is, and plants are far more complex than we ever realized, how do we move forward? The answer might lie in something called regenerative agriculture. Unlike modern farming, which often harms the environment, regenerative agriculture can restore ecosystems and even sequester carbon. Studies show that properly managed livestock that graze can actually have a net carbon sequestering impact, basically a positive impact on the planet, actually reversing the damage caused by industrial farming. This means we don't have to choose between ethical food systems and our biological needs. We can actually have both. But here's the bigger picture. Regenerative agriculture isn't just about farming. It's about rethinking our relationship with food, nature, and ourselves. As we uncover more about our evolutionary heritage and the future of food, it's clear that we're only beginning to understand the possibilities. The history of nutritional science, the intelligence of plants, and the potential of regenerative agriculture all point to one thing: the need for a more balanced, nuanced approach to food. For too long, we've been fed oversimplified narratives that pit humans against nature, meat against plants, and ideology against science. But the truth is, we deserve better. So here's my challenge to you. Seek out real whole foods that align with both your biology and the planet's needs. And stay curious, because the more we learn, the more extraordinary and interconnected life becomes. So if you like this video, make sure to send it to one of your plant-based friends so you can spark a nice conversation about the consciousness of plants.